Cycles of repetition, unraveling the connection between trauma and recurrent behaviors. Part 3, repetition. Repetition is the third and final element we will explore, particularly in how it intertwines with hyperarousal to create a continuous cycle where survivors repeatedly relive their traumatic experience. This cycle often distorts reality, making individuals feel as though the original threat is occurring in the present moment. This distortion, rooted in the trauma itself, can make relationships particularly challenging, as the trauma frequently originated within a relational context. Specific elements of traumatic events can be replayed over and over, reinforcing the survivor's sense of danger and vulnerability. This heightened state of alertness or hyperarousal seeps into everyday life, manifesting its behaviors such as irritability, difficulty concentrating, and an exaggerated struggle response. The trauma echoes through intrusive thoughts, nightmares, flashbacks, leading to emotional dysregulation and complicating the survivor's ability to maintain a sense of normalcy. These repetitive behaviors directly linked to the original trauma can persist throughout a person's life unless they are actively addressed and resolved. There are manifestations of the long-lasting impact of trauma, serving as a coping mechanism that, while offering a false sense of safety, often distorts the individual's perception of reality. For instance, hyperarousal can lead to situations where someone might look out a window and mistakenly believe that the perpetrator is outside when it's merely a harmless object, like a set of bushes. This constant state of vigilance may provide temporary relief from the perceived threat that ultimately prevents the individual truly feeling safe. The function of behavior in sexuality, repetition, and safety seeking. One of the primary reasons many men come into treatment is the impact of their sexual behavior on their relationships. When we explore the function of behavior as it relates to sexuality, it is crucial to understand how these behaviors are often rooted in safety-seeking mechanisms, especially in the context of trauma. As previously mentioned, one of the core elements of PTSD is compulsive repetition. Since this book focuses on interpersonal traumas, it's essential to consider how repetition plays out in the lives of survivors. Repetition can manifest in several ways, and one of the most direct forms is reenacting behaviors related to the original trauma. The theory behind this is that by repeatedly engaging in behaviors that mirror the traumatic experiences, the individual is attempting to gain control over the unresolved emotions and dynamics tied to that event. For many men, this shows up in their sexual behavior, particularly in their consumption of certain types of pornography or engaging with partners in ways that mimic the trauma narrative. It is important to recognize that the repetition itself is not always about sex. Sexuality can be the shiny object, masking the deeper dynamics related to trauma. For example, for men who frequently use sex workers may not just be seeking physical satisfaction, but also recreating the transactional nature of the abuse they endured. The ability to control the terms of the interaction, from payment to setting boundaries, may mirror the way they interpreted the power dynamics of their trauma. In these cases, sex becomes a form of control, a way to keep emotional vulnerability at bay while maintaining a familiar, albeit dysfunctional, narrative. This repetition is less about sexuality itself and more about reenacting the dynamics of control and power that were present in their trauma. Another way this repetitive behavior can show up is through engaging in sexual relationships outside the agreed upon boundaries of a committed relationship. This breach of relational contract is often a way for men to emotionally disengage from their partners, using avoidance as a way to protect themselves from true intimacy. In this case, the behavior is not just about seeking physical pleasure, but avoiding the emotional vulnerability that comes with being fully present in a relationship. Additionally, this can have elements of self-sabotage, as cheating gives the individual an excuse to end the relationship on their terms, avoiding the possibility of abandonment by their partner. In all these examples, we see how repetition of trauma-related dynamics can be hidden beneath the surface of the sexual behavior, with sexuality itself acting as a shiny object that distracts from the underlying emotional drivers. Later in this section, we will delve into a concept of the circle of sexuality and how specific sexual templates are formed for men influenced by trauma. Understanding these templates is essential for helping male survivors reclaim a healthier sense of sexuality and intimacy, free from the compulsive repetition that once controlled their behaviors. In some cases, the repetition manifests in more complex, subtle behaviors that are harder to decipher. These behaviors are intricately connected to the trauma response and often reflects unresolved aspects of past experiences. While thrill-seeking behaviors may offer a socially accepted outlet for managing anxiety and reinforcing a sense of control, other repetitive behaviors operate on a deeper, more unconscious level, perpetuating the cycle of trauma and making it difficult for survivors to break from the past. Let's consider an example of repetition in the context of interpersonal trauma. A gay man, who we'll call Tom, came to my office after facing recurring issues in his long-term relationship with his husband, Richard. Tom and Richard had been together for over 20 years and had always had an open relationship with clear rules and requiring that they notify each other if they engaged in sexual activity outside the relationship. However, compulsively avoids telling Richard about these encounters, despite the agreement that they have in place. Richard's sense of betrayal stems not just from the sexual activity itself, but something that they mutually agreed upon, but from the lack of transparency and the embarrassment of learning about these encounters from another source. Richard feels hurt and confused, struggling to understand why Tom, despite the established rules, repeatedly hides these interactions. When we examine this behavior through the lens of Tom's trauma narrative, a deeper pattern emerges. Tom revealed that as a young teenager, he was involved in a sexual relationship with a man in his 30s. Although Tom initially did not perceive this as abuse, believing that he was gay and enjoyed the sexual activity, he eventually recognized that the secrecy about the relationship was significant. He understood that the adults in his life would have seen the relationship as deeply inappropriate, not only because of his young age, but because of the significant power differential between them. As Tom explored the past experiences in therapy, he began to see the secrecy required in his teenage relationship was a form of compulsive repetition linked to his trauma. Although it took time for Tom to recognize that this relationship constituted sexual trauma, he eventually understood that it's compulsive to keep secrets, even within a context where openness was explicitly agreed upon, was a way of reenacting the dynamics of his early trauma. This realization allowed Tom to become curious about the patterns in his behavior, leading him to examine the impact of his early relationships on his current life. By acknowledging the repetitive nature of his secrecy, Tom could start to understand it as a coping mechanism born out of past trauma, an attempt to exert control in a situation where he once felt powerless and vulnerable. This insight marked a significant step in his healing journey, allowing him to explore the deeper emotional currents that shaped his behavior and to work towards greater honesty and transparency in his relationship with Richard. Repetition, as seen in Tom's story, often involves recreating elements of past trauma in the present, even when those behaviors no longer serve the individual's best interests. Recognizing these patterns is crucial for healing, as it opens the door to understanding how past traumas continue to influence current behaviors and relationships. Through this awareness, individuals like Tom can begin to break the cycle of compulsive repetition and move towards healthier, more fulfilling ways to relate to themselves and to others. I believe that repetition is the most essential element in helping men understand their past experiences, interplay with the difficulties they face in the present. This recognition can be the key to unlocking their curiosity, allowing them to connect the past with the present. And due to gender norms, manly men are reluctant to explore their past or engage with difficult emotions, often avoiding these aspects altogether. However, by drawing their attention to the repetitive nature of the behavior, they can often see the connection between past trauma and current challenges, which can be a powerful motivator for deeper exploration. Let me share another example to illustrate the point. Brett, a man in his early 60s, has been married for almost 40 years and has always felt safe and connected with his wife. Despite this, he often struggled with feelings of disconnection from the world and a pervasive lack of joy. Brett, who had always remembered a traumatic memory from his childhood, but it wasn't until his 30s, after reading an article about a mass shooting, that these memories resurfaced with intense clarity, plunging him into a deep depression marked by anhedonia. Brett knew at this point his past was playing a role in his current struggles, but he couldn't quite connect the dots. He'd been in and out of therapy for years since this memory, yet intrusive thoughts continued to haunt him. During a session, Brett shared a story that seemed to hold the key to his repetitive behaviors. He recalled an incident from his childhood when he was at a friend's house. They were involved in a club together led by the father's friend. On this particular occasion, the father tied Brett and his friend up and forced them to put their genitals in each other's mouth. This overwhelming feeling Brett experienced during this event was a fear that he was going to kill his friend by drowning him. Given the nature of Brett's fear, I asked him if he had ever had any problems with urination. Startled by the question, Brett was visibly surprised, as if he had forgotten a memory had suddenly resurfaced. He then recounted how, as a young man, he had been obsessed, needing to void his bladder. He would empty his bladder before leaving his house. When in public, he would compulsively look and use the bathroom on an hourly basis. This behavior had persisted for several years, driven by an intense, irrational fear. As we explored this further, Brett immediately saw the connection between the traumatic experience with his friend and his compulsive behavior around urination. While this realization was distressing, it also provided a profound sense of relief. Brett finally understood the function of his behavior, validating the memories he had long doubted. This single insight allowed him to explore the thoughts not with fear and doubt, but with curiosity and renewed sense of purpose. By recognizing the repetitive nature of his behavior, Brett was able to see how his trauma had shaped his actions over the years. This understanding gave him the clarity he needed to explore his past more deeply and to address the root cause of his current struggles. In Brett's case, as in many others, repetition provided to be the key that unlocked the door to healing, enabling him to confront his trauma with a sense of curiosity rather than avoidance. Repetition is a keystone in keeping men engaged in treatment, especially since many men struggle to keep out of therapy on their own and often do so at the urging of others because of problems they seem unrelated to their sexual trauma. In this initial phase of treatment, my goal to help men is to see past the shiny object and explore what lies beneath, unlocking the answers that can help them manage their behaviors more effectively. The compulsive nature of repetition related to trauma offers men an opportunity to understand that they aren't crazy, but they are reacting to situations that have deeply impacted them. Once they find meaning in these patterns, their ability to manage them increases significantly. One final example. Let's revisit the story of John, who came to my office after being caught soliciting sex workers by his wife. As we explored his history, we identified two functions of his current behavior that we directly related to his sexual trauma. The first involved that he would ask sex workers what to do. In his trauma narrative, John was forced to perform oral sex on his stepfather, a secretive and powerless situation that deeply affected him. When we discussed his encounters with sex workers, John revealed the only thing he would ask them to do was to provide oral sex. And although these connections were made immediately, I was able to guide John to see that the pattern of behavior that linked this trauma with his current actions. He even acknowledged that oral sex was something his wife was unwilling to do, which further reinforced its compulsive nature. John also realized that whenever he felt out of control, whether in business, fatherhood, or his relationship with his wife, the compulsion to seek out sex workers became overwhelming. Despite not wanting to engage in these behaviors, the sense of relief he experienced when he did so kept him trapped in this cycle. Like other compulsive behaviors, they are misaligned with one's values. John felt tremendous guilt afterwards, which led him to further isolate himself. As we delved deeper into this behavior, John recognized he felt a sense of control over the sex workers, control that he lacked during the traumatic experience with his stepfather. With the sex worker, he could entirely focus on his own needs, and he had complete control over how the encounter would occur, a stark contrast to the helplessness he felt as a child. Recognizing this, John could see that this, too, was a form of compulsive recognition. Acknowledging the connection between the shiny object and the traumatic event initially provided John with a sense of relief, helping him to see that his behavior was not random, but deeply rooted in past experiences. The real breakthrough, however, came when he recognized that his compulsive actions were driven by a need for control, particularly when his life felt chaotic or overwhelming. This insight allowed John to understand that the function of his behavior, not a sign of being deviant or inherently unfaithful to his wife, but a misguided attempt to regain a sense of power and control through sexual encounters. By identifying alternative ways to perceive and establish control through top-down interventions, John began to see a path forward that didn't involve destructive behaviors. This realization was empowering. It reframed his actions in a way that allowed him to view himself with more compassion and less self-condemnation. Understanding that his actions were rooted in a need to cope with feelings of powerlessness opened the door for John to explore healthier ways to manage his emotions, his relationships, and his life, moving beyond the cycle of control and manipulation that previously dominated his life. Beyond PTSD, a closer look at the complexities of post-traumatic stress disorder.